Trust is one of the most valuable commodities in the world. Without it, the computers and devices we rely on simply cannot operate. This podcast delves inside the concept of trusted computing, looking at the ways standards and specifications can keep you safe from attackers. Hello, and welcome to a special edition of the Inside Trusted Computing podcast. You may have noticed a slight change of format today. My name is Carl Dunnington, and I work alongside the Trusted Computing Group's Marketing Work Group. And today I'm actually joined by our usual host, Thorsten Stremlau. Thorsten, how are you doing?
I am doing fantastic.
Great to hear. Today, the discussion will be focused on post-quantum cryptography and how businesses are preparing for it, because I know the TCG has recently published a report on the State of PQC Readiness. But I think before we dive into that, it might be good to kind of set the scene a little, and maybe you could provide us with an introduction to the concept of PQC.
Absolutely, Kyle. That'd be a pleasure. So obviously for many decades now, since the computer was invented, one of the things that we've been relying on is something that's fairly easy, which are just simple bits, right? And a bit can either be set to 0 and 1, and when you combine a whole bunch of bits together, you can then represent large numbers, and if you represent large numbers, that eventually then leads to being able to compute something. That is the traditional way of doing computing. And by the way, all of our security has also been built around this traditional way of doing security. So the way that we use keys in order to encrypt and decrypt things and assign things, those are all basically anchored in, I'll call it the legacy compute. There is a new form of computing that's coming out, which is something that's basically called quantum computing. And I'm not going to get into the details in quantum computing. Basically, a bit is no longer represented just by zeros and ones, but it can take on a multitude of different types of states. And while, by the way, that's really hard to explain, and as I said, I'm not going to get into it, this new type of computing actually is an evolving threat for those traditional ways of encrypting and protecting data. Because if we apply this new type of quantum compute to the way that these keys are generated and the way that these keys are used, then we become vulnerable. Now, luckily for us, commercially viable quantum computers are still a little bit off. And by commercially viable quantum computers, I mean quantum computers that can actually be used outside of your typical research and development type of environment. And there's a whole bunch of technical difficulties that are there. However, the way that technology is evolving, we are basically seeing, we're anticipating that in about, I'll call it 7 to 10 years, we do believe that a commercially viable quantum computer will be available on the market, especially, by the way, to those kinds of actors that have a lot of money, like, for example, state actors or other kind of, those kinds of environments. And so this is basically the threat. The threat is that in about 7 to 10 years, a commercially viable quantum computer will exist. And then using that commercially viable quantum computer, a hacker, or by the way, somebody that wants to get at particular data would be able to access it by leveraging this unique type of calculation that a quantum computer can do. And so what we've done is basically, as the Trusted Computing Group, is we've looked at, how ready are businesses to implement post-quantum cryptography. And that, by the way, describes cryptography that is ready for the advent of the quantum computer. And so what we're going to be doing over, the next couple of minutes is we're going to be talking about what the report showed, what we looked at, and a little bit of, what the businesses think and the optimism that they're showing as we move to implementing full migration around 2035 or so.
Well, I think this might be a good time to actually just dive straight into the report, Thorsten. So what sense did you get from the survey that you guys carried out regarding the understanding of quantum threats?
Well, it was very, very interesting. In the report, we specifically interviewed computer security experts, right? So, we didn't just reach out to anyone in all sorts of different industries. In that particular group of professionals that we interviewed, about 76% of them felt that they were confident in understanding what quantum threats they faced. as an organization. When we take a look at it from a geography perspective, it was higher in the United States with about an 83% confidence rate. UK was about 82%, and then much, much lower in Germany at about 63%. Now, what was also interesting, though, is that critical sectors like education, legal, and healthcare showed a stronger awareness. And IT and telecoms, who are basically, the organizations that should know a lot more about this, is they reported lower confidence. And it was probably because, they probably have a little bit of a deeper view of the complexities that are involved. And, when we talk about complexities, something that, not a lot of people understand is there is already value in encrypted data that is being transmitted today, right? So if I record now or harvest now and decrypt later, that's basically the term for it. So if I know that you are a pharmaceutical company, or I know that you are a legal entity, or I know that you have some sort of information that is probably still going to be valuable in about 10 years, I can actually harvest your data, I store it away, and once a commercially viable quantum computer becomes available, I can then start hacking it. And so, those are again, I think is a little bit more about that deeper knowledge of complexity. Now, lastly on the understanding of the quantum threat, supply chain sectors like agriculture or HR, they showed the weakest confidence in all of this, with about 18% of them not being confident at all. So, it was really, really interesting just to see a view of the understanding of the quantum threat.
It's fascinating. So did those security professionals provide any insight into perhaps when they say a PQC algorithm will be implemented?
There's obviously a transition phase of implementing PQC into a business. What was very interesting is that about 55% of the respondents that we interviewed expected at least one PQC algorithm to be implemented in their organizations in 2026. The optimism was highest in Germany, with about 70%, thinking that they'd be able to do that, and more cautious in UK with about 51%, and the US with about 45%. But when we take a look at it again, we didn't ask for any particular implementation. We just basically said are you going to implement at least one PQC algorithm? And so, 55% of the respondents said that they'd be implementing one in 2026. NIST has finalized all of the PQC standards in 2024. When we take a look at the complexity of all of this, especially, hardware complexity and all sorts of other things like it, the full integration is probably going to take around 10 to 20 years, right? So even if somebody does get their first one implemented in 2026, it'll probably take a little bit longer. And remember, again, a migration isn't just replacing your existing PKI. It's not just, looking at small scale algorithm swaps. You really need to adopt an entire approach with it. So EU and US roadmaps all basically are targeting 2035. So that's 10 years away still, for widespread PQC adoption.
Okay, interesting. Because I have read the report, and one thing that stood out to me, Thorsten, was that 91% of businesses that were surveyed as part of the report didn't have a formal roadmap in place. Is that correct?
Oh, yes. That's the interesting thing. Again, in surveys often, bring out some interesting responses. And in this particular case, that was it. It was, okay, so 55% of respondents are going to implement a PQC algorithm, but, as you said, a vast majority, not just a minor majority, didn't have a full-blown roadmap. So that was very interesting. Thank you. Yep.
That's slightly concerned, isn't it? But when it does come to adoption, did the security professionals identify whether their assets are PQC ready at least?
That was another one. That was another big one. Again, remember, offset in terms of confidence of doing something, but then, 81% of the businesses basically said that their crypto libraries that they're using today, or even their HSMs, their hardware key vaults are not PQC ready, right? So they're basically saying is, retrofitting their legacy system is going to require fundamental overhauls, not just patches. And we see that, not just in PQC readiness, but when we think, and I do want to point this one out, when we think of the time that it took enterprises to, for example, migrate from Windows 7 to Windows 10, and now from Windows 10 to Windows 11, especially when there's a highly integrated system, you can't just change that overnight. It's going to require a fundamental overhaul to make sure that it's compatible, that it's secure, and all those other things like it. And the problem is that there's skills shortages in the security space, right? There's 4.8 million cybersecurity professionals that are missing in 2025, and so even if enterprises wanted to do this, they'd probably still be facing a lot of skill shortages within that space. So that's one of the things. And again, by the way, same kind of thing is not everybody has somebody who knows how to implement PQC on their IT staff, right? A lot of companies rely on third-party vendors, and again, those third-party vendors don't have all of the skills either, or don't have the same skills resources available, and so there's a high reliance on third-party vendors. And then lastly, I think there's a disconnect between awareness and action, right? Which was one of the things that was really clear. It looks like everybody's aware. I do think that the action point is something that is still open, and that's going to leave organizations exposed.
That makes sense. I do think we should focus on some of the positives that we did see in the report, because it did identify who the key drivers of adoption within businesses are. Would you mind telling us just a little bit more about that as well?
Absolutely. So, I do have to say is that PQC readiness is getting extremely senior coverage. So in the organizations and everybody that we looked at, they are treating it with seriousness. It's the CTOs, the CIOs, and the CISOs who are always the main champions of PQC initiatives. So that's something that's really interesting. In Germany, 53%, basically we're saying that their CTOs and CIOs are the leaders. CISOs are at about 28% again, in Germany. In the UK and the US, CISOs lead, right? So that was in those organizations typically assign these PQC processes or drivers to their CISOs, given their higher understanding of security, and then looking at risk and compliance teams. In IT, healthcare, and HR sectors, they also relied heavily on CTO and CIO leadership. And then there were quite a few organizations or types of organizations and sectors like education and legal sectors that basically said hold on a second, we know all about education, we know all about legal, we don't know anything about this, so we're going to depend on external consultants in order to implement this, which is also something that was really commendable. So it's getting senior visibility, it's getting senior assignment, and where organizations know that they don't have the skills, they are looking to engage external consultants. So yes, that's something that's much more positive.
And in terms of the actions that these drivers are taking, what did the report find about the measures being taken by businesses when it comes to PQC?
Well, that was also good. I'll call it pretty good. I'm not going to call it excellent. I guess the good news is that, at least around 39% of businesses have begun compliance readiness assessments. So that's something that's really good, looking deeper into their infrastructure and into their requirements. A lot of them are doing risk exposure modeling. So that's, again, is taking a look at what risk are they exposing by not transitioning fast enough. And then also 37% are inventorying a lot of their legacy assets. That's what I mentioned in the previous item. Legacy assets aren't easy to migrate. And so many of them are doing a deep dive into their legacy assets in order to figure out, what's happening. And the other thing is, I guess, really only 2% of the organizations that we interviewed report that there's no action underway. So 98% of all organizations have started looking at this in some form or another. Now, UK and US, which was interesting, is basically driven by making sure that they meet all compliance requirements, right? So, they're afraid of losing business because they're not meeting PQC readiness, and that there will be certifications and compliance requirements to make that, to put that in place. Germany is showing a little bit more of a balanced approach and is taking, a larger look at both the threat, but then also compliance and the risk that they have. So that's something that's really interesting. The legal sector was prioritizing just basically vendor and product benchmarking, right? So taking a look to see who is going to be best in order to implement this. And yeah, that was something that was also really interesting from a taking action perspective. So takeaway is 98% of organizations are already doing something. And of those 98%, 39%, have already started a deeper dive into compliance readiness. So very, very good from that perspective.
Well, that certainly sounds promising. So that's the measures there that we're talking about. What about the systems that are perhaps being prioritized currently?
I have to say that was also good news, is, looking at it from a trusted computing group perspective, the number one thing that everybody was looking at is identity and access management, which was in top priority, 35%. That's basically just to keep bad people out of your stuff, right? To make sure that all of that is in place. And I guess the thing is that identity and access management is probably the highest vulnerable in terms of quantum attacks. And that's because of the algorithms, the RSA and ECC algorithm that are implemented. Those, as I said in the very beginning, are particularly, vulnerable to quantum attacks. In other sectors like finance, HR, legal, and engineering, obviously they're going to be looking at their focal items. And so industrial control systems were prioritized in those areas. And again, last thing that you want is for somebody to break into your manufacturing facility. Not by breaking in, I mean at a hacking level, and then basically, disrupt your manufacturing plant and do something else like that. So yeah, that was basically what those sectors were worried about. The US and UK mainly emphasized their IP and trade secrets. They wanted to make sure that, that their information didn't get out there. And education was very much focused on blockchain storage. I guess that's also to make sure that, immutability and things like that were protected. But, what we found out is that, and this is really good as well, is that the different sectors are properly prioritizing based on their unique vulnerabilities, which was a really, really good thing to see.
Well, fantastic. Now, sorry to take it on a slightly negative angle here, but I know there's always concerns in cybersecurity about available budget. I saw a stat recently that suggested that budgets in 2025, concerning to IT and cybersecurity, of course, they only grew by 4%, which was half the growth that we saw back in 2024. Did the survey suggest anything about how much investment businesses plan to make regarding PQC?
Well, actually, I don't think it was too bad. I do have to say as a percentage of the overall IT budget. Yeah, so I agree. I mean, before we start on the PQC budget, unfortunately, as pressure grows, as the economy sours in some areas or becomes more unpredictable, businesses typically go to the IT budget first in order to cut things because, that's the one that you can reduce a little bit. You don't want to, so that's something that, by the way, happens cyclically, and is something that we see quite a lot. However, allocation of budget was still specifically to PQC was still actually pretty good, with only 4% of UK and USA businesses saying that they're not going to allocate any budget to, or any special budget to PQC. So that was something that was good. 52% of US businesses actually said that they were going to be planning to spend more than 11% of their budgets on PQC. But we did see that UK and Germany are allocating much smaller shares due to tighter budgets, right? So that's something that's definitely there. So North America, it remains the largest cybersecurity spender globally. But, as always, budget constraints remain a major barrier to readiness. But you know what? I have a feeling that once organizations understand a little bit more about the risk that this poses to their business, right? Are you going to lose that proprietary, pharmaceutical, product that you've invested $1 billion into researching? Are you going to lose, engineering information or HR information about things that you did, or sales information? Those are all going to be threats that businesses have to face. So I am very optimistic that budget constraints I'm not optimistic the budget constraints will be lifted, but I am optimistic that there will be more investment in PQC over the next few years.
Okay, wonderful. That's good to hear. And I think even if there is budget constraints, I think finding ways to accelerate adoption will be key going forward, as you kind of touched on there. Did the professionals that we spoke to provide any insight in terms of what could be driving adoption forward?
Yeah, I already mentioned a little bit early on. So obviously contractual requirements are the top drivers, right? If I'm dealing with a business and I say that they must be PQC readiness in order to be able to bid on something or to be able to offer it in a market, then that's probably going to motivate me to be ready. So that was the top one. US and Germany emphasized contracts. UK highlighted industry standards. And so, and by the way, that was also fairly high on everyone's response. So while they wanted to all meet contractual requirements, they wanted to implement it using industry standards, right? And so again, that was a very positive message for Trusted Computing Group and our TPM 2.0, implementation. We took a look at this years ago and implemented a particular, crypto agility in our TPM, Trusted Platform Module, for those that aren't aware of the acronym. And so we are actually pretty well positioned to implement PQC. And by the way, since we published that as an industry standard and openly, I think we'll be able to meet the vast majority of the requirements in the segment, right? So I'm very, very happy with that. The government regulations were something, again, by the way, probably also driven by the nature of the business, were driven very, very high in the architecture and HR segment, right? Obviously, you want to make sure that you're not running foul of any HR requirements and that your buildings meet the code or meet whatever architecture requirements are there. And what was interesting is obviously, I think that does reflect the awareness of the lack of viable quantum computers today. Security incidents were low drivers, right? Especially in the US, where only about 15% of the respondents said that those were things that they were looking at. So, standards, contractual agreements, and government regulations, I think, were the top three drivers across most of the segments.
Fantastic. And it's great to see standards there, as you said there. I know TCG doing a lot of work at the moment in terms of building their specifications around the PQC algorithms that NIST and other organizations are standardizing and authorizing. I also know that in terms of what we asked the professionals, we also asked about their causes for concerns, right? Did they provide any insight into what's essentially keeping them up at night regarding PQC?
Yeah, that was interesting too. Obviously, this is where it showed that the respondents, in many cases were aware of what they were facing. So top worries were integration and compatibility, and then cost and migration complexity, right? That again is reflected in pretty much all of the other responses that we gave before. The UK is very, very much focused on budget, finding budget, and then also doing the training and making sure that legacy systems are compatible. Germany, I guess maybe because of the nature of them being an industrial, a nation in that particular case, they understood the timeline pressures in particular, right? Knowing that 2035, although it looks like it's 10 years away, isn't actually all that far away. And they also highlighted talent shortages, which is, something that's been plaguing Germany in the security segment for a very, very long time. Now, US also saw the integration complexity, but they also very, very much realized the value of the data today and what a harvest now, decrypt later attack, what kind of harm that could do to organizations. So, those are some of the things there. And lastly, I guess, looking at the cause for concern is, this is going to require some new skills. And so there was a generalized concern around job stability and career impacts as, PQC readiness needs to be implemented and the quantum computers start actually becoming a threat.
Okay, well, thank you, Thorsten. I thought that was a very insightful overview on a very interesting report with some really interesting findings and takeaways. I think it's pretty clear that PQC is an extremely pressing security matter that needs to be addressed soon. I think looking at what you've kind of told me there and looking at the report, I think there has been progress, maybe not as much as we'd be hoping in certain areas, but overall, I think there is promise there, and it'll be interesting to see where we're at maybe in the next 12 to 24 months in terms of the progression that we'll hopefully see. So thank you. Thank you very much, Thorsten.
Yeah, and I'd really like to point out, it's something that's very important. If you are a manufacturer or developer, the TCG standards, as we said before, are public, right? Use roots of trust and attestation in your implementations, and then make sure that the keys are used properly. And by the way, in the very near future, that they're also protected by PQC by adopting TCG standards. So thanks a lot, Cal. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And for everyone listening, thank you very much. And until the next episode, make sure you stay secure. Thank you.